I've mentioned, of course, a number of times on this channel, both in motorcycle-related videos and otherwise, that Bimota is one of my favourite manufacturers, not just in the bike world, but in general. Even though I love cars, Bimota really is up there for me because it's one of those brands which goes beyond just trying to be fast or trying to sell a lot of bikes. It's almost like the motorbike equivalent of a company like Spiker or Pagani or Koenigsegg in the car world, because they're not concerned with outselling their rivals. They are much more of a boutique alternative. This bike, the Bimota Tesi 1DES, and Tesi is actually Italian for thesis, which is an appropriate name, and we'll get to why in a second, is based in part on a Ducati. The engine itself is from a Ducati. It's an 851cc V-twin, putting out 117 horsepower, which doesn't sound huge, but for the time, that's pretty decent. It was a concept which came from the 80s, actually came to fruition in the early 90s, and this particular version, the ES, or Edition Speciale, of course in Italian, is actually one of the rarest Bimota models ever. Only 50 of this particular model were ever produced, and they have very, very big prices both in this game and in the real world as well. In the real world, at the time, they were over 23,000 euros, which is a huge amount for a motorbike, and in the game, over 50,000 credits is a massive price for this vehicle. So what you actually get from it if it's so expensive? Is it just kind of a for the sake of it collector's piece, if you want to look at it that way, or can you actually use it to race? Well, thankfully, you definitely can. Now, for me personally, although I love the brand of Bimota, I didn't initially like the Tesi or Thesis range. Because, put simply, I've always thought that the Thesis range just looked weird. In particular, due to the front steering setup. Instead of having those original conventional forks that most bikes would have, you have this more horizontal arm layout, which looks interesting. It certainly looks very 80s, or what the 80s thought the future would look like. But the difference with this bike, and this is something which I didn't realise until I started looking into it, was that it's not just for the sake of it, and that is why I didn't like the bike. I thought it was just different to catch people's attention. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, it just didn't do it for me. However, it did have a purpose, and it's a really cool one, because the reason why it's called the Tesi, or Thesis, is because the design of this bike originated in the 80s as a racing concept, because one of the advantages of the steering setup, and in effect the suspension setup as well, that this bike has, is that it drastically reduces the harsh effects under braking over the front end. So instead of having all of that lunging under braking and all of that harsh feedback, including of course vibration etc. sent up through the shocks, it redistributes that through the rest of the bike. Now some people don't like that because it makes the front end feel a little dulled compared to a conventional bike, and it also doesn't lunge as much under braking, which if you're going fast, which this bike is, beyond 160 miles per hour, that can feel a little bit disconcerting when you slam on the brakes and it doesn't lunge in the same way that a usual bike would. Now the weight on this one is 188 kilos. That's really good. I wouldn't have expected it to be quite that light. I would have assumed maybe around 200 kilos, which would put it on par with more something like a Ducati 748 to come out a little bit later. But it's not, it's lighter than that. In fact, this bike in ride is 1 kilo lighter than the Aprilia RSV Milli. Not the factory version, but the standard Milli. That's pretty impressive, given that that bike is, you would assume, superior. But no, it's not. Now, of course, for 54 grand, you would kind of hope that it has pretty good numbers, but it goes beyond the numbers, because the numbers themselves, although good in context, won't necessarily blow you away. 117 horsepower doesn't sound that great, especially when other bikes are pushing 160, 180, 200 in some cases, and that of course is partially due to its age. But the way to fall in love with this bike is to ride it. Now, of course, in the game, we have the advantage, and this goes for any vehicle, of not having the adverse aspects of riding a bike or driving a car. We just have all the good stuff. So there's no reliability issues, money is far easier to come by, you don't have to repair the bikes, and also there's no fear of death. So although racing games are of course about play, they do in a sense allow you to experience the best points of these amazing creations without all of the drawbacks. And of course the drawbacks are sometimes part of the charm, But in the case of a bike like this, for instance, it doesn't feel dull at all. In fact, the handling blew me away. I did not expect this to outhandle the Ducati 996, which is one of my favourite handling bikes in the game, but it did. Easily. In fact, the comparison was such that my tuned, heavily tuned Ducati 996, with modifications as well, did not handle as well as this bike in its stock form, which is what you can see here. The cornering is incredible, the straight line speed is certainly beatable by modern bikes, but of course this is a whole nother level of bike. It's a limited edition based on a much cooler concept than I originally gave it credit for, and so if you do play Ride and get the chance, and of course the money as well, to experience this bike, I would actually say it's one of the best Bimotas in the game, because it goes beyond just being yet another superbike, or even a gimmick, because it's not a gimmick. It's actually a genuinely good and different idea, which is extremely well executed. So overall, definitely worth a look. A bike which has certainly gone up in my estimation after researching it a bit more. And for now, that's it for this pick. So of course, I'll see you guys next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.